let's talk about how to ineffectively start off a book. Now, we're talking all about writing books today for our weekly Q&A Ask Me Anything Hangout session. We're talking about ineffective starts for stories, which means we're discussing things that are not going to get your reader's attention, will make them go and choose another book, and things that are no longer effective in the industry. So things that are dated and expired and no longer acceptable. So let's break down a couple of really good things that you should be doing and things you need to avoid at all costs when you are writing your stories. If you're just jumping in and you are joining me today, let me know where you're joining me from and if you happen to be writing a story as well. We're going to give some tips and tricks today and answer your questions down below. So let me go ahead and pull up my graphics so y'all can see how to write an ineffective start to your story. So we are going to be chatting about this today, and I hate the new way that they've got the graphics up here. It makes it so much more ineffective. Speaking of ineffective things, let's talk about it. So you should always be starting a story with action so that we know what the stakes are and we have a reason to like your main character. We are looking for something that moves us forward. So if a book starts and it is slow or it is boring and doesn't get our attention, if it's wasting our readers' time, they are not going to stick around to read the rest of the story. So when you start a book, you need to start in a way that you need to start in a way that is moving your character forward. You need them to be taking action, physical action. They need to be doing something, going somewhere. You're showing us the stakes of the story. What is at stake if this happens, or if this doesn't happen, or if this character makes this choice, or if they don't make this choice. You're moving us forward with that action because action gets attention. Think about movies and TV shows. If they're boring in the first minute or so of that movie or TV show, you're going to lose interest. You're going to click away and find something more interesting. So once you've established the action and the stakes, what's at risk, what we're dealing with, and give us a reason to actually root for that main character, then we can deal with all of the extra stuff that's a little more on the boring side. So we are going to be breaking down the things that you should not be doing to start your stories. Go ahead and continue to drop your questions and comments down below. We're going to get to those in just a second, and we're going to be chatting about things you should never, ever, ever do to start your stories. And one of the biggest ones is sleeping or waking up. There are very rare exceptions to this, and I've done this in one of my novels because it was actually the pivotal moment of that story. That was from my Golden trilogy. So when Goldilocks wakes up and runs away from the bears, that's how I started my story, and that was a very rare exception. Traditional publishing will not accept this anymore. They're just straight up not going to take it. Indie publishing, it's going to cost you a little bit too. So sleeping or waking up, that gives us the idea, like the writers think that because the character is waking up and they're exploring the world around them and they're figuring out what's going on, that we too are going on that journey. That doesn't help anybody. That's not taking action to move us forward. That's kind of establishing some of the world building, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So we avoid sleeping and waking up at all costs when it comes to creating your stories. That should never be the first thing that happens inside of your tale. Now, another thing we're avoiding is looking in the mirror to describe ourselves. And that goes for anywhere in your story, but particularly for starting your story off. Because we don't need to know what your main character looks like right off the bat. That's something we're going to learn. We're going to learn about your character, who they are, what their personality is, what their background is. As we go, we're going to learn that in the terms of conversation with other people. We're going to learn that during the action. We don't need to give a description in your first couple of paragraphs. This shouldn't even be in your first chapter in most cases. We'll get there. We'll learn about it. Right now, your job is to get us invested in the character, and knowing that they have green eyes isn't investing us in your character. That can come later on. So we're not looking in the mirror and we're not describing ourselves. That doesn't happen. That doesn't help. That's not going to make you succeed in the book world. So never start your book off with that looking in the mirror-ness. So after that, one thing that we definitely don't want to be doing is giving a bunch of background information right off the bat. So a lot of people will start off with describing things that used to happen or the history and things that led up to it. We don't need to know any of that. Remember, we're starting with action. We're starting with the stakes. We're moving things forward. So we do not actually want to know this background information. This should be later in the story, and this comes in the terms of dialogue with somebody else. So good writers, and this is the mark of good writers and wannabe writers. Good writers know how to tell backstory in terms of conversation throughout the novel. not as info dumping at the beginning. If somebody's info dumping a lot of information and like background stories and histories and things, that's the sign of someone who doesn't know what they're doing inside of the industry. So we always skip that background information. That works into conversation later on, and that helps to build things up. Keep dropping those questions. We're going to continue to answer all of those, and I am actually jumping into one of them right now. We have a question about prologue. Prologues typically do not work. Those have not been effective in the industry for a while. Traditional publishing typically stays away from them for as long as I have been a published author, even before they were no longer really accepting prologues. So if you gave a prologue, they would usually chop it because, again, that's the sign of a weak writer. You need to be a strong writer who can put that information into the context of having conversations throughout the course of the story. We're discovering these things during the action, during the things that move us forward. Anything that's like historical, anything that's like prologue-like, that actually stops us. It holds us back because it's not in the same time frame. It's not the story. It's before the story. So we're going into it with kind of like historical overarching things that we don't actually need to know right now. We just don't. And that stops us. And then we have to start again for the first chapter. So you should never, ever send a story with a prologue to a traditional publisher. You always start with chapter 1. Even if you've written a prologue, always start with chapter 1, because the second they see prologue, out. Prologues typically don't work. This is something very much in the past. Occasionally they work, and sometimes I've had prologues, kind of, not really the historically kind, more of like the set up the story kind, but again, signs of strong writers are when they do that in terms of the story. We shouldn't have to have a chunk of information to understand the story you're writing. We should be able to understand the story you're writing without that and then learn it as we go. So no, in most cases, you should not have a prologue because it's just not something that we do. This was like 6-7 years ago in the industry, and now we are moved forward and we're stronger writers at this point so that we don't actually have to do that. The last one I want to chat about before we get into questions and comments and all these things is world building and introductions. So if you spend your first chapter world building, if you're telling me like describing everything around me in the world that they live in and like all these things, or if you're introducing me to a bunch of characters, oh, this is my best friend and this is the sister and this is the mother, you're wasting time. You're not getting people's attention. Remember, we're moving forward with the action and with the stakes. You're telling me why we need to be invested in this character and what this character is about to go through, what they're about to suffer through, what they're about to experience. You are setting this up in a way that we are very quickly latched onto it, and we want to know what happens next. Everything else, the backstory, the historical stuff, we can learn about the characters' traits and the world that they live in as we go. So your first couple of paragraphs to first chapter really need to be the action, moving us forward, telling us what your story is going to be about, and then you can establish all the rest of this. And do it in the context of the story. We're not stopping to info dump. We're not like dropping all this stuff on people. We're doing it in a way that's organic and natural to the story that makes sense for what we are doing inside of the story to move people forward. Remember, we're starting with action. We're getting our characters introduced in a way that we're going to latch onto them, but not in a way that we're learning their favorite colors and what their hair looks like and what they wear for outfits. Like, we can get there. All of that, we can get there. But if you have a boring and slow introduction, if you're just info dumping, people are not going to stick around for that. They will leave. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at some of your comments and your questions. If you've got questions on this, I would love to get those answered for you down below. Here we go. Hi, hello. Hello, I'm writing a story, but it's going very slow since school takes up a lot of my time. Well, that happens. School needs to come first. How do you write a time jump? So for time jumps, you're probably just going to want to start them like at the start of a new chapter. You're not going to want to do that in the middle of a chapter unless it's just like the next day or 2 days from now. If it's a significant time jump, it should be its own chapter, and then you would just say 6 months or 2 weeks or whatever it happens to be. Or you can show the passage of time with the world building, which we actually had a conversation about this, I want to say maybe 2 weeks ago. Not too long ago, we actually had a conversation on the live stream like this. So all you're going to do is you're going to show me your world building. Maybe your story is taking place in summer and then you're time jumping to fall. Show me the different colored leaves. That's going to tell me without you actually having to tell me that we have time jumped. So time jumps can be like time of day. If you start out in the morning and then it's all of a sudden it's evening, you're going to show that shift by the way that the environment is around them. So time jumps can be denoted by how you are describing the world around you, or you can actually use words like it was a long 2 weeks until she saw him again, whatever, kind of a thing. I love when authors explain backstory by using a character from a different place, culture to explain. Yeah, that is definitely something that people do. You want to be very careful how you're doing that because it's a very obvious way of like, you're here specifically so that we can explain this kind of thing. You want to make it a little more organic to the story and a little less obvious in most cases, but sometimes that does work and it does allow you to kind of flesh it out in that way. So somebody who doesn't understand it necessarily can be explained to these things, but I wouldn't do the entirety of it explained to this person. Have a piece explained to them and then explain it a different way in conversation. Again, it's the mark of a weaker writer and a stronger writer, the way that people are denoting these things and explaining these things inside of their story. If it's a very blatant, obvious, you're new here, so let me explain this to you, that's lower level. If it is something where you're having a conversation and you're remarking on something that has happened, but it's very organic in the terms of the conversation, that's a higher level writer. So you're going to learn and grow with that as you go and get to know how to do that a little bit better. Study books that do it well, and you'll learn how to do it. How much do you describe at a time? That's a really good and important question because it shouldn't be a lot. That, again, comes back to info dumping. So if you're info dumping history or information or backstory inside of the tale that you're creating, that is just not great practices. If you're dumping all of this, it's not good. So we want to discover a little bit at a time. Remember, the characters are going to know more than the reader knows. The character understands the world that they're in. They understand the situation that they're in, and they do not have to look at somebody and give 2 paragraphs explaining the back matter of what's going on. They just don't have to do that. And so you want to give little breadcrumbs to readers along the way. It's very, very much leading them and guiding them to this conclusion. You want them to figure it out themselves. You want them to be like, oh, I get it now. This makes sense. This works with the world building. This works with the characters. Like, this is starting to make sense. These histories and these backstories and the information is all starting to connect. And you want it in these little tiny breadcrumbs so that they are guided toward that ultimate conclusion that they figure out themselves, or they kind of piece it together. If you're just handing it to them, that's really, it comes down to not trusting your reader and making it, like, how do I say this? You do not want to be like, I know you're not going to understand this, so here's 2 paragraphs on it. You very much want to be, I'm trusting you to put together the pieces. Here they are. Here are the puzzle pieces. I've spread them throughout the story. Now go ahead and piece them together and make those connections. So you really want to rely and trust them because they're going to be able to get it. Readers are not dumb. They understand, they're going to pick up the breadcrumbs, and they like to figure this out. Think about reading mysteries. People like to find the little clues to get to the point to where they announce the big bad villain. You knew who it was because there were little breadcrumbs, little things along the way, and you were able to piece it together and figure it out before it happened. So before you give them these 3 paragraphs explaining this thing, give them all these little breadcrumbs. Let them make the conclusions. Let them jump to these different ideas and figure it out on their own. That's the sign of a good writer. So you give them the little pieces and let them put it together. So a fact here, and then a fact here, and then a fact here, and here. And it can be throughout the course of, a long conversation. It can be over a couple of chapters. It can be throughout the entire book. You do not have to tell them everything. And you know what? They don't even need to know all the historical backstory type stuff. They just don't, unless it has a very specific reason inside of the story. They don't have to know everything. You do, because you're the author. But they don't have to know everything. They have to know what they need to know for the story to make sense. You don't have to tell them everything that you as the author knows. And you don't have to tell them everything that the characters know. We're leveling up our writing here. Whew. All right, if you've got a couple more questions, go ahead and drop those down below. But let me just reiterate what we are talking about today. So we are going over ineffective starts to stories. You want to avoid things like waking up or having them sleep and come awake at the beginning of the story. That does not tell anybody anything. That doesn't help us understand the world. That is an old school way, and traditional publishing has said absolutely not for many years. Indie publishing doesn't like it either, so don't do it. It's old school. Don't do it. You do not want to have them looking in a mirror and describing themselves. We don't need to know what they look like right off the bat. We're going to get there, especially based on the way other people interact with them, the conversations they have, the things that they say, the way that they are engaging with all of this. So you want to make sure that that's later on. You do not need to tell me that she's blonde and has brown eyes. We're going to get there. You want to make sure you're skipping any boring background information. All of that needs to come into the story later. Later in the first chapter, chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 46. We do not need it right off the bat. Skip the boring backstory. We're going to learn it, get us into the action, and make us actually want to follow your main character's journey. You want to make sure you're skipping any historical prologues. Prologues in general do not work anymore. They're old school, and they actually stop the progression of the story, and then we have to restart it with the first chapter. That does lose a lot of readers, especially because prologues are very much in a different voice than the rest of the story. So just don't do it. And then you also want to make sure that you are not super focused on the world building or telling us your character introductions. We're going to get there. We're going to understand that dystopian world that you're writing or the fantasy magic system that you're creating. We're going to understand it. We don't need to understand it in sentence 1. So we will get to all of these things and make sure that you are creating a story that gets people's attention. Action, physical action, moving them forward. They need to take some kind of action. What about starting it off with a conversation? Yeah, there can be conversation, but they have to be taking action. Again, physical action. We're moving forward. If we're sitting around at dinner, that's boring. If we are moving forward and we're going to the market to get stuff for the dinner that's going to be disrupted and whatever, that's good. We want physical action. We're moving them forward, moving them from one location to the next. We are telling them what's going on. So if we are just like standing around the stable, just getting the horses ready to go riding, that's boring. If we are on horseback racing across the field and we're being chased, that's exciting. Now you've got our attention and you've told us what the stakes are. They are being chased. Because of some reason, we'll figure that out. They're going somewhere. They have to get somewhere in time. We're going to figure it out. But you've taken us forward. So don't start in the stable brushing the horses and tacking them up and just standing around talking. Start on horseback, moving toward whatever it is or away from whatever that happens to be. Does the first sentence matter? I hear a lot of people talking about the first sentence. 100%. Your first sentence, your first paragraph, and your first chapter will determine if people are going to read your story. You don't hook them immediately. Bye. They're not going to stick around. If you have a boring first sentence, if your first sentence does not move us forward, if your first sentence does not get our attention, we're done. Think about walking into a bookstore. How long do you give a book before you walk away from it? You may look at the cover. Okay, that's only going to take a second. You may look at the back cover and read that blurb. If that doesn't get your attention, bye. If your first sentence, if people open it up, they'll take the time to read maybe the first page. But if you, in the first couple of sentences, really don't hook them in, they're going to look at another book. So you have to have a strong first sentence. And it doesn't mean it has to be the sentence to end all sentences. It doesn't have to be amazing. It doesn't have to be poetic and literary genius. It doesn't have to be that. It does have to get my attention. So again, if we are having a conversation where it's like, how's your day going? I don't care. Bye. But if they're on horseback racing across the mountain to get away from the evil villain who is chasing them, now you've got my attention. You have to do something to grab that attention and to keep them going. If you have a romance in books where the couple are already together, how do I make the readers root for them? Oh, baby doll. So if you have romance and they're already together, congratulations, you can do kissing scenes early on. We love this. Rip them apart. Make them mad. Make something bad happen. If you've read any of my books, any of them, you know I like to put people together and then tear them apart. It doesn't matter if they're coming together later in the story or they're already together at the beginning of the story. It doesn't matter when they get together. I will give them a little bit of happiness. I'll give you a great kissing scene and then I will tear them apart. I will remove them physically from each other. So they will be in different locations. They can't be together. I will make a fight happen where they are not speaking to each other. I will make something happen to tear them apart, whether it is like an emotional separation or a physical separation. But you have to take them and remove them. You have to get some kind of wedge between them, whether it's physical space or it's some kind of emotional, mental thing. You got to put something in there and then make people root for them. So give them your really great romance and give them lots of sweet things and then destroy them. You can piece them back together at the end. It's all good. But read my books. Read any of my books. I got a bunch of them and you can see how they are ripped apart and put back together sometimes. That was mean. Usually they get back together. All right, friends. Thank you so much for joining me today as we talked all about Ineffective Starts 2 stories. If you have more questions, please go ahead and leave them on any of my Instagrams or send me a DM. I will happily get that answered for you. And I will use them as topics for upcoming live stream Q&A. Ask Me Anything. We're here every single Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern, answering your questions in real time. We're going live on Amazon tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern, meeting 3 new authors and me. And we're going to be talking about books for you. We're going to pitch our stories to you, which you can then grab right on Amazon. You can go to bookfairlive.com, which will kick you right over to tonight's episode live stream where you can ask us questions and interact with us in real time. Super, super fun. So make sure that you are dropping those questions, those comments, and you're joining us for the live stream. Also, please make sure that you are waiting about 1 to 2 minutes. This video is going to be up on Instagram, and I do need some comments because the comments here in the chat box don't count. So please go leave your biggest takeaway from today's conversation or your ideas for upcoming episodes of our live streams. We'll also be here on Friday over on TikTok at 3 p.m. Eastern answering your questions, open Q&A every single week. Y'all, I will see you next Tuesday here on Instagram for more, on Amazon tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern, and on the YouTube page every single night at 6 p.m. Eastern with brand new episodes of vlogs, behind the scenes, publishing help, and more. I will see you in our next live stream. Bye, friends.